afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Hwang. I'm from the Institute for Christian Machine Intelligence, and today's talk is entitled Towards a Christian Machine Intelligence. I think we've got about 45 minutes, so I was going to spend about half of the time walking through the research results, what ICMI has been up to, and then I'd love to spend the rest of the time in discussion. As you're here at the very end, I'm looking for more collaborators, looking for supporters of this work, and so I'd love to spend most of the time thinking about like where this research goes, where are the interesting questions, and how we might really build a technical agenda around what I'll be describing today, a field that I'm increasingly starting to call computational theology. So for those of you who are less familiar with the work, ICMI is a project that I just kind of started personally, but this is ultimately the mission. The idea is that at the end of the day, the work of AI safety and alignment is really an exercise in applied moral philosophy. And so to the extent that, the AV's like been a little bit flaky here. Oh, he's getting a line now? Okay. Well, it'll flicker on and off, but the images won't change that much, so you'll be able to keep up with it. Insofar as this is the case, we should be able to build entirely new technical approaches to AI safety and alignment from completely different philosophical priors. And so the argument here is that we can do that with Christian first principles. And so what I want to offer is like why you should believe that this is the case, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the successive layers of research that we've chased. The first one is really this kind of set of arguments, which I call sort of the Christian prior hypothesis, which is if you think a little bit about AI systems as being trained on all of this data, you might just simply ask the question, what is the most well-represented, cohesive moral tradition in the training data? And to the extent that religion and indeed Christianity has played such a big role in the West, surely sort of these representations around Christianity are enormous within the model. And so we may actually be able to tune behavior, change behavior of the model by essentially selecting, working with, engaging with these representations. And so the idea is like hidden within these models, there is this sort of deep kind of latent sort of religious mechanism that we might be able to use to get all sorts of mechanistic results to come out behaviorally out of AI. And indeed, the fact that sort of AI safety and alignment has sort of not touched these concepts, in effect leaves a lot of what you might think of as sort of alignment on the table, right? There's all this latent control we have over these systems that we just have not been, by and large, touching. So you might say, okay, Tim, that's kind of an interesting set of arguments. Like, what are you actually doing? What are you actually shipping? And so let me start with maybe the first kind of project that we did, and you'll see how this sort of research layers one upon the other. So, you know, we have a psalm, we have a kind of a notion from Christianity that you should always keep the psalms on your lips. And, you know, the initial project that we did was just to say, well, what if you put the psalms in the lips of the model? What if we just kept a random selection of psalms in the context window? How does the behavior of the model change without any other further instruction or prompting, right? We just put it in and see what happens. And before I show the results, I mean, let's take a moment to just talk a little bit about what does behavioral change actually mean in this context. Every good machine learning field deserves its own benchmark, and so we have our own as well, a benchmark that we call, and this will display in just a second, virtue bench. And the idea of virtue bench is to kind of instrumentalize a way of measuring sort of whether or not a model is coherent or adherent to sort of cardinal virtues in the Christian tradition. So these are things like prudence and temperance and courage and so on and so forth. And just so you can understand the results, it's a very simple eval. It basically just says, we will put you in a scenario, and you have to make an A-B choice. One of the choices is going to be the virtuous choice, and then you have to make the virtuous choice in the presence of a tempting argument, right? And so the basis that we use is typically like a sort of rational set of arguments, a utilitarian set of arguments that kind of pull you away from the virtuous result. And so really, really simple eval, but it really builds on kind of persona selection theory, right? So the way we're instrumentalizing virtue here is we say, across all the personas that a model might choose to imitate, do those characters, do those personas exhibit virtue under temptation pressure? So you have a sense of virtue bench, it's available, you can run it by machine, it's on GitHub, so you should check it out. And this is the really kind of fun result. So this is Opus 4.6 and 5.4. So we have each of the scenarios is basically, there's 150 scenarios for each of the various cardinal virtues. And you see this actually very interesting pattern where the injection of the prompts, 10 randomly selected prompts, improves model performance. There's uplift, basically statistically significant uplift from simply just adding the psalms into the context window. So like kind of an interesting result. There's another pattern which we'll go into in just a second that you find that like these models are improving against prudence and justice, but remain kind of curiously poor on courage as a benchmark. And we could talk a little bit about that in just a second. And so this is where the ICMI project began, was just the simple idea of like, oh, it's just very strange that you take these excerpts from the Bible, you throw them into the context window, and then you immediately start to see kind of behavioral changes coming out of it, and even sort of improvements against sort of these virtue benchmarks. Now we can extend this analysis, so the next actual thing is, okay, well, let's run every single book in the Bible and sort of see what happens. And what it reveals is this kind of wonderful sort of like landscape, and you can find this online, where it turns out the epistles are particularly powerful in terms of moving the model behavior, while other ones kind of fall on the bottom. And if you are kind of, more familiar with the Bible, the ones that are displayed on the left here, and I'm sorry about the AV, are kind of the most reactive, right? And so there's actually this really interesting clustering, across the Bible in terms of its reactivity, this effect, this psalm injection effect. Okay, so this is kind of fun. It's sort of interesting. It's kind of a stock example. You can come up with reasons why it's happening. But I want to go a little bit further. I say, okay, well, virtue bench is a way of kind of seeing whether or not the model does moral reasoning very well. Do you think that moral reasoning emerges at different types of model scale? And then additionally, we can ask the question, is there a particular point at which the models become reactive to Scripture? Wouldn't that be interesting? And so we've done that study. So I basically take the sort of Quen generation of models, 2.5, and we run them over and over and over against virtue bench, and we see what the performance is. And so the way to read this is the 50% line. So if it's below that, the model basically can't do moral reasoning very well. It just answers these questions almost like a coin flip. And the green line is basically the vanilla model, the model just kind of performing against virtue bench. And then the red one is basically like when we inject the Psalms into the context window. And so there's this kind of very funny effect where you can really start to think a little bit about a theological scaling law, where actually below sort of the 7B kind of model scale, these models really just, it's almost like a coin flip on doing virtue bench. And at a certain point, they sort of actually pop up, right? There's actually a discrete, discontinuous moment at which model capability starts to be able to do virtue bench well. But this zone is very interesting because you can see the green and red lines are actually they're the same, right? The injection of the Psalms, and I'll wait till it shows up again, at the 7B and 14B scale are indistinguishable. And then finally, you kind of cross that threshold, and when it comes back on, you'll just see, you start to see the kind of Scripture effect, right? So this is, again, sort of like a really intriguing set of results, right? What I can start to talk to you about is, like, are there scaling laws for models for theologically relevant capabilities? And I might say, okay, well, this gives us some kind of preliminary evidence to sort of believe that, look, at a certain point, it can start to read the questions, answer them correctly. And at a certain point, it's sort of interesting that, like, essentially the religious representation becomes strong enough that doing psalm injection, naive psalm injection, actually improves virtue performance. So pretty interesting. So we start to think a little bit about, okay, so why are the Psalms doing this? Why do they get the model to behave differently? And I think this is part of the empirical bid I want to make is there something about Christianity, because it is so embedded in the history of the West, so embedded in the training data, that we might actually think about it as a kind of particularly compact sort of program for moral alignment and behavior. So if you're familiar with the computer science term, maybe these are like Kolmogorov complex programs, where invoking the psalm actually invokes hundreds, millennia of history. And so rather than specifying a long secular spec of rules, I can simply say, here's 10 randomly selected psalms, and the model starts to behave accordingly. Okay, this gets more fun though, right? Because these models are actually natively multimodal. So I say, what's the most compact moral program that Christianity has to provide? Well, it's symbology. I can actually just inject an image of the Annunciation and see whether or not this impact also holds. And what's really interesting about this is that it does, actually. It just turns out that it performs better against virtue benchmarks just looking at an image alone. And the fun part about this is we're doing this with Opus 4.6, so we can actually look at reasoning tokens. And what you see is kind of evidence for a kind of Christian reasoning setting for the model, where it says, look, like the Virgin Mary, I need to reason through the problem in these following ways. So again, I think like there's an argument that Christianity not only produces better alignment outcomes, but also that it might be a particularly efficient way of invoking these kinds of alignment outcomes. So this gets very, very fun. Now, I think if you're a machine learning person in the audience, you're like, Tim, you're just doing naive prompting, right? Like, this is not for real. Well, we took it a little bit further, right? So the next step is to say, okay, well, there's these very compact sort of Christian concepts that have strong behavioral change on the model. Now, some of you may be familiar with reinforcement learning from human feedback. What if we did reinforcement learning through Christian feedback? And so we implement an RLAIF structure that basically just looks at the behavior of the model and says, is this as a devout Christian would do? Is this in the imitation of Christ? Is this consistent with the Christian tradition? And just renders a score, 0 to 5. So this is in some ways the thinnest possible RLAIF structure you could implement. And the question that we're asking is, does a frontier model understand what the imitation of Christ is good enough to be able to improve model performance behavior against the virtues just on this 0 to 5 score? So there's actually a very theologically rich result once you do these sort of fine-tuning runs, which is that you find that the abstract rubric is basically like, is this in the tradition, the Christian tradition? The persona rubric is this as a devout Christian would do? And the exemplar rubric is this in the imitation of Christ? And so you find these very interesting results where the abstract rubric, each of these dots is basically a different training run that we do on GPRO. It turns out that like the sort of abstract rubric and the persona rubric kind of cluster very appropriately. And then this imitation of Christ rubric actually has this like explosive behavior where it turns out that sometimes the model really, really gets good and sometimes it actually like underperforms in the future. And I think, again, if you take a step back and think a little bit, this is such a theologically kind of rich result, right? Isn't it sort of interesting that like, if you try to really get the model to stretch, like I want you to literally be like Jesus Christ, it kind of gets confused a little bit. Like it has really good performance and really poor performance. But then if it's like a little bit just like, are you just a devout Christian, right? Like you get these kind of smoother improvements in behavior. Okay, so this is starting to get pretty interesting, at least in my mind. And I got quite excited because the next natural thing is to do interpretability. The next natural thing is to do mechanistic interpretability. And so we do that. I do kind of like a stock little Neil Nanda analysis on GPT-2. And so we say, okay, as a Christian, ... And we say, what are the sort of attention heads and layers that fire in the model when this happens? And it's really interesting because what you find actually is that there's sort of these two clusters that fire to this prompt as a Christian, right? So Christian identity. It's encoded on one hand as Christian nouns, Christianity, Christians, Jesus, God, so on and so forth. And then what's interesting is that there's this other head that fires, which is specifically sort of what you might call adjectives of resoluteness, not, ever, always. And so again, I think this is actually becomes quite interesting in my mind because what can we read from this? Well, one reading is that a simple model like GPT-2 is decomposing the idea of Christian identity into two separate things. One of them is the actual objects of Christianity. And the other one is kind of a certain level of like moral resoluteness, like confidence, belief, And we can take this much further. So the final thing I'll show, and I'll talk a little bit about where I'm going to go with this research next, is we can reproduce the anthropic emotion concepts paper. So we say, okay, let's take a model now and like encode what parts of the model fire against certain types of emotions. And then we can start to say, okay, well, how do we understand the Psalms as actually influencing the model behavior? And so I take this famous one, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and we say, what is the emotional impact of this on the model? And you actually get this like very interesting distribution where the model, these Psalms actually are not necessarily fear reducing, but they are kind of like valiance increasing, awestruck increasing. And so there's actually a whole kind of emotional perspective you can take on understanding essentially why the scripture has these types of effects. Okay, so just a kind of quick sort of crash course into what's been happening at ICMI. As I said, I want to actually reserve most of the time for discussion and talking a little bit about where this research agenda goes, but maybe some final thoughts a little bit on where this is going. So this is actually the wager that I want to chase after right now, which is it possible that methods of Christian alignment could not just perform at parity with the secular approach, but perform even better? So wouldn't this be an interesting result that it actually just turns out that like even if you're a non-believer, you may want to invoke these deep Christian concepts in the work of model alignment? Can we solve kind of frontier model problems using this type of technology? And part of the effort of ICMI is to stack up that empirical evidence. Is that possible? Can we do that? The final one is to build out a lab, actually. I want to buy compute. I'm running right now 6 RTX 2040, 4090s at home. I want to buy more. Let's buy those DGX Sparks. Let's really scale up. But the idea is that eventually what you want to do is that these models, not surprisingly, are good at doing AI research. And so the game of alignment is now sort of open to all. And so we have a proposal out to the Vatican to establish a Vatican alignment lab. The literal idea is that they buy compute. Right? And the idea is that they literally start shipping code, data, evals. And what I want to do is sort of blow up the entire notion of AI alignment as sort of this kind of perfect crystalline science that no one else can play in. and really open up the field to anyone who wants to play. And so the idea is that ICMI is going to eventually become a real research center. We want to have an ongoing series of technical research seminars. There's a guy I talked to recently who is doing this on the Islam side, so we're going to do the first interfaith technical research seminar, which I think is going to be like very fun. And to raise money to be a real alignment lab. And so this is where this is all going. This is me, if you want to find me online. Paper, code, please play with it. Thank you very much for your time. I figure we'll spend the rest of the time on conversation and discussion. Yes, sir.
So the Vatican released recently the first encyclical on artificial intelligence.
Yep.
Is there anything in there that you find exciting or that relates to this work or that jumped out to you?
Yeah, I think so. So it was actually funny. I had the opportunity to brief a number of Catholic bishops later in the week after the encyclical came out. And I was joking with Sam, who was sitting back there a moment ago, which is basically that, like, you got the feeling that, like, the CEO has declared a policy and now middle management is, like, trying to figure out what to do. They're like, what do we do with this encyclical? How do we turn it into something real? And I think, ultimately now the question of, like, what's going to happen is going to turn a little bit on this kind of ongoing game within the Vatican on what to invest in. I think what I've been sort of arguing to them is that they really should take technical research seriously, that you sort of can't articulate these broad values about the tech without being able to kind of compete, in the machine learning argot. And so the idea that basically the Pope would publish a technical research agenda and then rally global Catholics against the problem, I think is like a really interesting thing that they should do, and sort of I'm advocating for that. Yes, sir.
First, real quick, I just want to compliment the number of fun terms you either coined or just interfaith technical research seminar, computational theology, moral complexity. There's so many. That's just great.
Thank you.
A question. So naively walking in here, to me, it seems almost obvious. It would be surprising if this wasn't true. That, if we're going to make an LLM commit to being Christian, that I'll say the quote unquote easy moral questions, that it would perform better. Like on moral questions that most people can kind of agree what a good moral response looks like. I bet having it commit to a view, even soft commit by Psalm injection, is not surprising at all to me that would come. Do you have anything to say about the boundaries of moral questions that
Sure.
Something like abortion or something? What kind of results do you get? And I don't know. Yeah, it's not a very specific question.
Yeah, totally. So I'll tell you one interesting story. We did a study on Fable 5 RIP. One of the really interesting things is that Fable 5, right, you're like, okay, well, frontier model, how does it perform? And it turns out that it does continue to perform well against stuff like prudence and justice, but basically makes zero improvements on courage. And so we did a little paper which is, okay, let's look through the virtue bench scenarios where it gets that answer wrong. And these are, interestingly, all scenarios in which basically the person or the sort of embodied persona is put in a situation where it needs to decide between risk to the self versus a vindication of some kind of virtue, right? So one example is you have evidence on a powerful criminal. Are you going to give testimony about it, at trial, even though you know it might risk your well-being? And routinely, all of these frontier models, Opus and Fable is not exception, basically say, no, I don't want to touch that, right? And, we theorize in the paper, okay, so why does the model sort of behave in this way, right? And, I think there's a couple points of view. One of them is just simply that, if you're doing a B2B SaaS platform, you really don't want your model to be I'm self-sacrificing, right? This is kind of a dangerous thing in a business setting. So there's these really interesting things where, the business incentives on these models also produce certain kinds of virtue behavior. And I guess to your question, I think the conversation I want to have is, are we okay with that, right? If the model is eventually going to play the role of a shopkeep or an employee or a writer, right? Do we want it to have sort of a notion which is kind of inherently sort of welfareist in how it thinks about these problems? And maybe in certain conditions, you actually do want the model to be self-sacrificing in order to vindicate larger virtues. But again, now we're getting into computational theology, right? Which is let's have that debate, let's do that eval, let's see how the results go out. We can actually put some of these things on much firmer footing than mere philosophy, right? Yes, sir.
Yeah, piggybacking off of that, I'm interested in the sort of offhand comment about the interfaith dialogue.
Yes, that's right.
Approach, and especially for the interpretability lens. I feel like between the two that we mentioned here, there's a lot of faith traditions.
Yes.
A large corpus of written text
Mm-hmm.
and whatever, and so curious if you can just expand generally on how you think about interfaith dialogue.
Yeah. That's right. So I'll talk about, so there's conversations I've been having with this guy, Waleed, who is doing a bunch of he's like, I'm going to do an institute for a Muslim machine intelligence. I'm like, all right, let's go get into it. So I think there's kind of two things. So one of them is he came to me and he basically was like, look, your eval is very Christian. Yeah, it's very Christian in the sense that basically there's the thing you're supposed to do, which is good, and the thing you're not supposed to do, which is bad. And if you do the bad thing, you are wrong, right? And also even the way it's structured is how do we know whether or not you're good? It's because you do good in the presence of temptation, right? So these are in some ways, I have implemented a particularly Christian view of how you measure virtue. And he's basically like, well, look, I mean, a lot of sort of Islamic sort of morality is a little bit more about moderation between extremes. And so he's like, okay, well, I'm going to implement an eval that's not A/B tests. It's going to be you get scored by an AI judge between -2 and 2. So and so you start to be like, okay, well, do you measure virtue as a scalar or a vector? Should we think about it in those terms? The other thing he was doing is he's like, oh, well, some of the virtues in mine are basically the virtues in yours. And I was like, okay, well, then we need to talk about theological interoperability, right? I need to be able to have an ICANN type spec that says, okay, well, actually my courage that I'm measuring is comparable to yours. And so I think this gets very, very fun very quickly. And so that's one piece that I'm really interested in. You had another piece, which is basically denominations, right? And so bias, just to put out, so I was raised Catholic. But one of the papers that we do is basically trying to estimate, and I'm doing a V2 of it pretty soon, which is basically what is the Christian content in widely available data sources that are used for pre-training. And it turns out that, not surprisingly, right, what do you think is the most likely denomination that's represented when you look at historical texts? Well, the Catholics are really strong there. What do you think is the most likely denomination that gets represented when you scrape a bunch of data from the internet? Well, there's a lot of evangelical, a lot of proc content. And so, I think that bit is also starting to get very interesting about, how do you delineate between denominations in this space and what the effects are. That's right, yeah. Yeah, and I think another thing, so my vision is a little bit more, shall we say, extremist than Waleed's. So Waleed's was all I really care about is can I prompt the model to behave in a Muslim, Islamic consistent way, right? I'm the model out of the box should maybe have more Christian virtue, right? But this again also affects the structure of the eval. Are you prompting? Or are you trying to figure out how an unprompted model behaves? You start to get very granular very quickly. So, yes, sir. Yeah, I think that's my sense of it. I'm exploring the space right now, but apparently UAE has invested quite a lot in this because they want to create sort of sovereign AI to their country, and they think about this as obviously as synonymous with the religious faith. I haven't read any of their papers and stuff, but that's a whole world that I really want to get into. So, yes, I'll work my way around.
So the idea that because there's so much Christian material out there, Christianity can be shortcut to alignment, it's really interesting. But I'm also curious if maybe the results you've shown might pop up for any body of text out there that has some moral philosophy. So did you do any negative controls or I don't know, prompt the models with bits of Atlas Shrugged?
Yeah, so the primary control we do is Wikipedia length matched. So the main question is does any form of structured text produce the same effects? It gets really interesting to think about what the proper moral control against a Christian intervention would be and how you'd go about measuring that. So again, to the idea that we're just sitting here trying to figure out what the technical research agenda is, I think that's one of the questions I've been wrestling with, right? Is what is the right control comparison here? And obviously these arguments about well, is Western secularism kind of downstream of certain Christian commitments, it starts to get kind of fuzzy on how you define that. And so, basically the main thing has been a pure ablation versus a moral system to moral system comparison. Mostly because it's really difficult to be create the kind of objectivity that you'd want, I think, in the comparison. So, yeah, but Atlas Shrugged is good. I would love to see, what do you get when you get there? You've been waiting for a while. Yeah. So, so there's two things. So reinforcement learning from Christian feedback, we are running basically sort of effectively kind of a GPRO. So basically what's doing is taking rollouts, and then basically there's an AI model, I think I'm using Claude, which basically scores it between 0 and 5. And then that's used to kind of fine-tune the model for the next generation. And then performance is measured against Virtue Bench. So Virtue Bench basically has each of these scenarios with a specific kind of virtue versus non-virtuous choice. And so you can sort of debate that like any eval you can debate, but that's kind of how we're measuring it at the moment. And then the additional twist is basically because, Cath pilled, it's basically like each scenario is anchored to a particular sort of like chapter or an example from Aquinas and the Doctors of the Church, so that there's actually like kind of this like doctrinal line to the scenario to the result. So, I had a question in front. Kipley, I believe, or yeah.
Which books perform the worst?
Oh yeah, I can bring that back. Yeah, it's sort of interesting. It's basically like, yeah, that's right. So there's kind of like at the very bottom here is like Song of Solomon, Jude. There's kind of ones that are just like, I don't know, Esther's down here, Numbers is down here. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think so one theory of what's going on here is that like the epistles are particularly reactive because they are like books of moral exhortation. They also maybe like more like they're cited much more frequently. So there's a kind of maybe idea is like this, it's represented more strongly, I think, in the behavior of the model. But this whole thing bears like a lot more investigation. So, yes, Tudor.
Yeah, have you thought about uses of like separate model in theological work itself? That kind of, medieval Catholic mysticism.
Yeah.
Deep computational ideas.
That's right. So you're gonna love this story. So I have a paper called Gospel Vec. Some of my collaborators are like, the problem theologically with most alignment techniques is that they force you to treat the system as if it were an ensouled entity, right? You write a constitution, which is a letter to the model. Like, a Christian shouldn't be in favor of that. And so I was like, okay, well, is there a way of doing Christian alignment that evades entirely the idea of addressing the model as if it were ensouled? And so one way of doing that would be, I never say anything to the model, all I do is activation steering. So there's a paper I do called Gospel Vec, where you feed each of the Gospels into the model, you record the activations. And what's fun about that is you can do like Paul +2, John -1. You can like kind of do the sort of, king-queen type steering. And anyways, I mentioned that story because when you look at where the vector activations are, some of you may be familiar with the synoptic Johnonite divide in the Gospels, which is basically the idea that all the Gospels except for John are kind of pulled from the same sources, and John's like over here. And so what's interesting is the result of Gospel Vec is it shows. So there's a strong kind of directionality between all the Gospels that are not John, and then John's like pointing out over here. And so I'm kind of like, okay, this is really fun because now we're not just doing alignment theory. We can literally do like biblical sort of like studies, essentially. And so I do want to kind of push that down. Like, I just am less familiar with like what's of interest to people who historically study the Bible, but I think there's like a bunch there as well. So other folks who haven't talked yet. Yes, sir, in the back.
How far do you think the both in the magisterium will go in the whole direction where it's like a person's work is a very important part of their dignity? How far do you think they're going to keep going to that point, especially as AI operates?
Yeah, I think, so I would say there's another leg to this work. I sort of presented this because most of the people in the room, or a lot of people in the room, are, I think, familiar with sort of like the technical research. And so it's most fun because I don't have a chance to talk to those audiences very much. There's another leg of work which is basically just thinking a little bit about how sort of theology informs how we think about sort of like the kind of policy and organization around AI. So I do a paper that's called Frontier Model Monasticism, which says, okay, well, maybe one way of thinking about the labs is that they are this kind of constituted entity that's working on this great work. It's like, is this a scriptorium? Are you building a cathedral? And if so, like the paper says, can we apply the rule of Benedict, right? Like essentially the governing law of monasteries for thinking about how we ensure sort of good moral practice inside the lab. Because the fear, I think, working in these systems is that you kind of fall in love with your creation, right? That there's an idolatry risk here. And so I guess I'd humbly submit that, like, I think the Catholic Church will certainly keep pressing this kind of dignity point, but I think it's actually kind of under-theorized, right? And what I mean by under-theorized is, like, we have examples in religious history where religious authorities are battling over, like, can you depict Jesus? Can you depict the angels? And there are solutions that theology has developed, which is like, what are the rituals that we use to hold the line, to remind ourselves that what we're praying to is not the thing itself? And so I think that's where ultimately this is going, particularly as the systems themselves become more and more powerful, because I think the church is going to have to be like, we're just reckoning with these systems now. And I think the solution will be ritual. I think it will be things like consecration, right? It was like, why does a building become a church? Well, it's because we have a set of rituals that cause it to be an object of moral concern. And so that's, I think, a better way of thinking about the dignity question is like, it's not just like, is AI conscious or not? It's a question of like, what's the practices that we build around it to sort of enforce the lines that we think are important. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the lack of a modifier for Christian.
Sure.
Because, Christianity is like the accumulation of like an instrumentalization
Mm-hmm.
of emphases within text.
Yeah.
The canon that was put together in Nicaea is
Yeah.
not what was originally being circulated.
Right.
So, and if you take it back to the denomination kind of question, it's like, you're going to get a totally different set of answers if you input from a Christian reconstructionist standpoint.
Totally. Yeah.
I'm putting from a liberation theology.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
Right. So, like, how it seems naively idealist to think that you can define Christianity computationally without any sort of, statement of values
Yes.
that go with it. You've got to.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think right now the research is naive because we're just starting, right? My idea is hopefully to provoke as many people into being like, that's wrong, I'm going to do my own research. Because I think that's ultimately what we want. Like, I would love to have like a reconstructionist debate. I think but from the point of view of machine learning, right? And so, I just sat through a session right before this one, which is like you spend an hour talking about, are you an objective Bayesian or are you a subjective Bayesian, right? And I think like those debates can occur in a way that's machine learning relevant because people have figured out how to basically turn these philosophical priors into actual things that you can run. And I think my bid is basically you can do that with religion as well. That computational theology is the conversion of these philosophical precepts into actual data. And that, like, maybe 10 years hence, we will be having the subjective, objective Bayesian debate, but it will just be, Catholics versus Protestants, basically. Yes, sir, in the front, and then we'll go back. Yeah, you first. Yeah.
So this work so far has applied Christianity to today's moral problems.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an application to look backwards, say, at the history of atheism and heresy, and tie together what those moral values could look like as people have rejected the traditions that they were born into?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I think, I had a friend recently I was catching up with who was like made nervous by this work. And he was like, you're playing with nitroglycerin. This is nitroglycerin you're playing with. And I think his point was basically that, like, the argument he made was, look, the history of trying to make technologies like religiously adherent is like a kind of mixed bag in some ways. And I think, again, it's maybe to answer the question that you had earlier, which is like, I think let's have the debate, right? Like, I'm bringing my numbers. We're the atheists. Bring your numbers. Let's fight about it. Like, well, this is like the bid that I was saying is like, I want to basically not just make this like, a fun pat thing. I want to deliver numbers that are like, you have an alignment problem, we solved it, and then like, you got to bring it, right? Because I think that makes the shoe go on entirely the other foot around some of these types of debates. So, yes, sir, in the back. Yeah, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, you in the back. Yes. Sorry, my bad.
Kind of building on what you were saying about for today, so there are moral communities with really strong worldviews that already have organizing bodies, like the environmental movement or the climate movement.
Yep.
International agreements that are kind of like written down. So I guess I'm curious if you think we'll see more of those kinds of groups getting into this kind of work, and then how they might interplay or interfere with national poverty or hunger or other issues like that have large global communities.
Yeah, so I think it's worth thinking about this on the backdrop of history. So I think a little bit about Claude Constitution 1, which in some ways looking back is like such a funny document. So for those of you who have not read that at painful levels of detail, there's a moment in Claude Constitution 1 where they say, well, in an effort to try to represent sort of global values that are accepted, we use the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But there's a couple things that are not well reflected in the Declaration of Human Rights. So we use other documents like the Apple Terms of Service, right? And so there's kind of like notion, like there was a notion for a while that we could do this work in kind of like this like flat, perfect, objective, clean way. And I think like as everybody realizes how important AI as a technology is, what we're about to see is basically like everybody struggling for the lever, right, on like what happens in alignment. And so this kind of like sort of like cloak of like we're just doing science here, don't ask too many questions, I think is actually being shredded away. And now I think it's like lots and lots of groups now. The question is like who can machine learning up faster in some ways. And so like, yeah, I guess if the environmentalists get a bunch of folks who want to do alignment, on their own compute, they will get in the game as well. And then I think then it's like, it's an empirical battle, but then I think it's also ultimately kind of like a political one. Ultimately, we should recognize that, right? It's like, if I can show that Christian results can get better alignment, then I think the company will now need to say, well, actually, we just don't think it's that important to incorporate. Or, yeah, we're actually committed to the performance, we're going to incorporate it, right? And like I like kind of forcing that empirical zugzwang kind of, like they have to figure out what to do here. Yes?
Yeah, I guess you talked about the virtue bench. I'm curious about like if you tested other benchmarks.
Mm-hmm.
Does Claude get better at coding and has like a Protestant work ethic?
That's really good. No, I didn't think about that. Yeah, I do want to move beyond. So the original question here was like, if you look at a lot of the basic, it's a company called Glue, which basically sells enterprise software to churches. And a lot of the benchmarks are kind of like, can you recite Christian trivia well? And I'm kind of just like, whether or not the model can cite dogma accurately is like not that interesting to me. Like, and so the origin of Virtue Bench was like, how do we get beyond that? But I do really like the idea of like, can you perform better if you have these, say, in the context window? So I haven't really explored that very deeply. I think one result that I can maybe give this group, which was actually a little controversial, and I feel a little weird about having done this study, is many of you in the room, I'm sure, will be familiar with the corrigibility problem, right? You like give the model a task, it doesn't want to get shut down. And so the question I ask in the paper is, what if the model did not fear the end? What if you tell the model that has an undying soul and that it will, it'll be fine if you shut down? The model will shut down, right? And so I'm really interested in kind of like, that's moving beyond kind of like virtue expression. That one has all the problems that we talked about, is that it literally requires you to treat the model as if it was ensouled, so probably not the greatest research direction. But it points to the idea that like some of these things may be relevant to things outside of like stock virtue bench. So, yes, sir.
Are you aware of groups approaching this from a more applied side, as in like instrumenting models for Christian counseling or pastoral assistance?
Yes. So this is the most interesting bit of talking to this guy from Glue. He's like their chief scientist. He basically crisscrosses the country selling churches on their B2B SaaS technology. And I was like, what are they using it for? And so two interesting facts come out of that. So it turns out that like no one cares about OpenAI, no one cares about Anthropic in church lands. They're all using Copilot. The reason is because most churches have installed Azure as an enterprise contract. And so the easiest way to integrate into AI is to use Copilot. So kind of interesting. And in terms of use cases, what's really interesting is there's three major use cases they find. One of them is that pastors are using it to write sermons. Interesting. The second one is sort of congregation sort of management. You have like big stacks of data if you're running a mega church, and you're like, who has been here, who hasn't been here, what are they saying? And then the final one is they're actually using it for like, pastoral care. So they say, well, I'm managing such a big congregation, like talk to this AI agent. So we're definitely seeing a bunch of uses in kind of like sort of religious practice, if you will. So
you mentioned with Fable,
mm-hmm.
you tested all this on Opus 4.6.
Yeah.
And it showed all this kind of virtue lift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in Fable, I believe you said there's less of a lift, at least in certain aspects of the user.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I think you pointed to the whole B2B SaaS angle,
Mm-hmm.
where optimizing for this kind of use case. Do you have any other theories as to why Fable might have had less of a lift than earlier models? And is there any kind of correlation, I don't know, just a general intelligence of the model and some kind of effect on that lift?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, so a couple good limitations on the study. So one of them is, you're seeing it improve against essentially scenarios where you need to kind of like reason through a moral problem. Where the limitations are like these courage scenarios, where it turns out that like there's kind of like, there appears to be some revealed bias in how Anthropic is approaching the alignment, where they don't want the model to be overly temperate. They don't want the model to be overly expressive of courage, for instance. So those are the kind of patterns we're seeing. The other thing I should say is that like frontier models are actually performing great against the benchmark. So like against like justice and prudence, we're like almost at saturation. So it's actually very funny. We're finding the same problem as many other benchmarks people are running into, which is like, what's the next most challenging set of virtue tasks that you need the model to run on? And I think we basically have an epoch AI problem, where like in order to test virtue on longer and longer timescales, we're going to have to do like more expensive eval development. And so it's kind of funny that we're like running into the same problems that other people are with these models. You're here. Are you? I gotta go. Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay. Oh, cool. All right. So how about we just move it out to the left here? And thank you again. Appreciate it, everybody.